of O.J. Simpson, the public face we all know, and now in large measure thanks to the preliminary hearing and all of the coverage in the press, the private face which is alleged to exist as well. And then Marcia Clark, who is the lead prosecutor, who is so far taking us in great detail through the night of the murder. We are joined by people who have no admonition not to talk about the case. In fact, we'd like them very much to talk about it. Let's go to Los Angeles and our three analysts. Leslie Abramson, the defense attorney, is with us today. Robert Philibosian, the former District Attorney of Los Angeles County, and Peter Arnella from UCLA. Peter Arnella, let me begin with you, as you're the last photograph up there. What's your overall first impression?
Well, Peter, I was surprised that the prosecution in its opening statement started with the why Simpson did this, and only then went to, in Marcia Clark's argument.
He's a travel agent. He gave her his business and encouraged his friends to do likewise. This man had a great relationship with his in-laws. He did wonderful things for them. Took them all on trips, paid their way, took them all out to dinner. They'd go to Hawaii and Cabo San Lucas. This is the same man that Mr. Darden was talking to you about. Mr. Darden says that she never worked. O.J. Simpson encouraged her to become a decorator. She became a decorator. He helped her get jobs from his friends. She redecorated the Rockingham house to the tune of $1.5 million. And he paid her. He paid his own wife a fee to decorate the house. This man that Darden was talking about, this man gives $5,000 every year to the Angel City Links, an inner-city black organization. And the condition of his gift every year is it has to be anonymous, that he doesn't want to know he does that. The thing that he's perhaps proudest about are these next two things I'm going to tell you about. Number one is his mother, Eunice Simpson there. As soon as he was able, he bought her a house. She still lives in that house in San Francisco. This is a man, 47 years old, who grew up in the poor areas of San Francisco, in Potrero Hill, but he never forgot. Became rich and famous, but he didn't forget. So that to this day, he buys the uniforms for the kids at the Potrero Hill gymnasium, where the kids go to work out. He still does that, even right now, even while in his jail cell. Bought his mother's house. You'll hear about those kinds of things. And the second thing he's most important, proud about, is that he had a child who drowned at a young age. That's always a tragedy, and you'll hear evidence about that. And the pronounced effect that it had upon him. And after that, he became involved in all of these kind of pediatric endeavors. And he has participated in raising hundreds of thousands of dollars for Camp Good Time, for kids who have cancer. He's very proud about that. There's testimony and evidence about that. People who know him, not people who speculate about him, will come in and testify about those things. And so, when Dr. Walker tells you that for a wealthy person to give gifts doesn't mean you're exercising any control. One of the sisters needed some money, up to $5,000, and he gave it to the sister and her boyfriend. And the condition was, don't tell Nicole. It's a lot of control, isn't it? And when you hear about theories, I'm going to tell you about the facts. So you'll hear from Dr. Walker, and you'll hear ultimately about the battery of tests. And I think you'll find that she will say that in looking at O.J. Simpson and interviewing him, and looking at him at this point, she finds no evidence of antisocial personality disorder. I think you'll find that becomes very important in this case. And understand that this is no Janie come lately. This is the leading lady in America who testifies in these kind of cases where a battered woman shoots and kills her husband. So this is an area where, obviously, you'll get a chance to see her qualifications and her ability as she goes about this. Now, back to Mr. Darden's discussion. It tells you a number of things that I'd like to address, at least some of them, with you now. We've already covered the so-called ugly mood by showing you the photograph. We've covered the aspect of the flowers, because Mr. Simpson did get flowers, but he went out and got those flowers. We'll cover the aspect, let me talk to you about Mr. Simpson at that particular recital. I've told you how he came back to California specifically to go to that recital. that he'd come in to Paul Revere at about 5 o'clock and saw his ex-wife. He had to get his ticket and take his ticket back to the person at the door. That his daughter was 30 or something on the program. You've been to those programs where your child is going to come up and she's like, there's probably 100 people there and your child is like 99th, and you have to be very interested until you get there. So this was like 30-something, and she was at the very end. But as all parents, you kind of sit there and you're really proud of the youngsters, and you do that. As the program was going, he remembered that he didn't have any flowers. So when he first got there and he was sitting, he was 2 seats away from his ex-wife, Mr. Cole Brown Simpson. Wasn't staring at anybody. Wasn't glaring at anybody. Wasn't jealous about anything. In fact, you'll hear the conversation he had with Ron Goldman, who was still in the group. There was a group of them who ran around together in Brentwood. And O.J. Simpson was commiserating with Ron Goldman about his problems he was having. Please forgive me. Ron Fishman, excuse me. I heard those sounds. I'm sorry about that. Thank you. Ron Fishman. He's the man who took this picture here. He was talking about his problems with Cora Fishman and the group that ran around together. The testimony will be that he was saying, I'm glad to be out of it. I'm back with Paula. And was he back with Paula? Yes, he's back with Paula. The night before this trial is over, we'll have another picture, but this picture will do for now. By the way, this is Mr. Douglas is going to help us because there are some graphics and things. Hope you'll bear with us. Thank you, Mr. Douglas. Your Honor, can you speak to see this picture? Would you like to sit here? We'll call this, this is number 8. 1 and 2.
I thought we had agreed that it would be defense 1, 2, 3, 4.
I think the clerk has not changed it.
All right. But we're going to have so many, Mrs. Robertson. I thought we agreed on this. For now, we'll call it defense 2. And Mrs. Robertson will explain to me the error of my ways at lunchtime.
Okay, that's fine. You are in charge.
No, I'm not.
Oh, I see. This is in 201. And number 201 is another example of O.J. Simpson. This photograph, there'll be testimony, was taken on June 11th, on Saturday, June 11th. That is a charitable fundraiser. I think $25,000 a plate, by the way, to the benefit of Israel. And that's O.J. Simpson there. Now, that night, on Saturday, June 11th, he went with his girlfriend, Paula Barberi, who had picked him up at the airport on Friday evening, June 10th, when he came back from working in the East from New York. They spent that time together, and they went out Saturday evening. And so this picture, again, is graphic evidence of O.J. Simpson and who he really is, it seems, to us. As I said, there is another picture of Paula Barberi with him there that we don't have yet, but that we will. Now, Mr. Darden talked a lot about Miss Simpson being weak and that he exercised all this control over her and picked her friends. The evidence will show that Miss Nicole Brown Simpson was a very strong, independent woman, very attractive, and an excellent and wonderful mother. But the one thing they never fought over or never had any arguments about were those children. But they both mutually loved those beautiful children, and that was very, very important, it seems, to both of them. That she picked and chose her own friends. That O.J. Simpson or no one else could tell her who her friends were to be. She had whatever friends she wanted. She did whatever she wanted. He tells you about 2 incidents where he alleges there's stalking. Let me tell you the facts and the true facts about those incidents, backed up with witnesses. There's a man in Los Angeles named Joe Stellini who owns a restaurant in the West Side out on Pico. He's a good friend of O.J. Simpson's. They went out to dinner one night. And while out to dinner, they became aware of Mr. Cole Brown Simpson and their party. This was the time when they were separated. And they had an agreement, generally, that if one or the other came in while they were there, the person who was there first would leave or whatever. There wouldn't be any problems. The incident regarding Joe Stellini had nothing to do with Mr. Cole Brown Simpson or her party. He was out to dinner. They might frequent the same kinds of places. You'll hear from Joe Stellini, and you'll see it was not anything about any stalking. The other incident was about Mezzaluna, I believe. It was an incident where they both were at this restaurant. Mr. Simpson's party had already been seated when he came in. And again, you'll hear from these parties who will tell you that these were not any stalking incidents. If you live in Brentwood and there are restaurants, hot restaurants in that area, and you go out to dinner a lot, you're going to run into each other. And there was no hostility, no stalking, no jealousy, no nothing. And so he tries to paint O.J. Simpson as a jealous man. Let me tell you what the evidence is going to be about that. You heard about this incident of Keith Zlomowitz. I'm sure as a witness who's going to be called. Mr. Garden described it. Remember, he said yesterday, well, he didn't punch out Nicole and he didn't punch out Keith, or words to that effect. He certainly didn't. What happened was, Mr. Simpson, in one of these incidents, had seen his ex-wife out. They went out dancing afterwards. He stopped by her house afterwards to try to talk to her. He would go by and woo her on occasion. And the evidence will be that when they first broke up, he was advised in January of 1992 that she wanted a divorce. Between January and April of 1992, it was hard on him. Knowing somebody for 17 years, he didn't want to lose her. He likes family. He learned that from his mother, and he's got this close-knit family. And he likes that. He loved his children. He didn't want to lose his wife. But something happened in April of 1992. As soon as he became aware that she had a boyfriend, from that point on, his interest changed, and he went on. And when he saw what he saw with Keith and Mrs. Simpson, he then went on with his life with Paula. That's when it started, in April of 1992. And so what happened was he wasn't peering in any windows. He came to the front door to try to see his wife. And he looked in, and he saw his wife making love to a gentleman on that couch. Now, according to Chris Darden, wouldn't you expect that he would just blow up, become ballistic? He went home, the evidence will be. He came back the next day to talk to Mrs. Simpson about the fact that the kids were upstairs, and what he saw them doing, he didn't think would be appropriate. One of the kids came downstairs. And so when he came back on the next day of this incident, he saw Keith, I think, sitting astride Miss Nicole Brown Simpson, giving her a massage or something in her shoulders. O.J. Simpson talked to both of them, shook Keith's hand, went on his way, and said essentially, look, I don't think you should be doing this in front of the kids or whatever. They didn't tell you that Keith Zlomowitz moved in with Nicole that summer. But O.J. Simpson was back with Paula. Didn't bother him. He knew she was there, that Keith was there. Was he stalking? Was he jealous? Was that a rage? I think not. So, again, I want you to take these facts and look at them. But there's an even more painful incident, probably, that tells you that he's not jealous. He has a very close friend, somebody who's very near and dear to him. The evidence will show who had a relationship with Nicole Brown Simpson, because she told him so when they got back together, and this gentleman told him so. And it was hurtful, but he never said a harsh word to her or this gentleman. He didn't go ballistic. He didn't do any of those things. In fact, you know what he did? He let this gentleman get married at his Rockingham house after learning this gentleman had been intimate with his wife. That's what O.J. Simpson did on that occasion. Your Honor, may I put you on?
Just in case you've just joined us, the camera in the courtroom today is quite fixed. It does not have the range of that it had yesterday. Not altogether sure precisely why Mr. Cochran has taken this brief chance to consult. We do know that the judge has decided that it will be permissible at some point for...
10-minute recess. Love the tie. Love
Port
the
pan.
supporters. All right. Let's take a 10-minute recess, ladies and gentlemen, if you'll just step back into the jury room, and we'll resume in 10 minutes.
Okay. You hear that as clearly as we do, and the judge has decided to take a recess. We'll be back in just a moment.
ABC News coverage of the State versus O.J. Simpson will continue after these messages and a word from our ABC stations.
The O.J. Simpson trial, if you've been with us, you know that Johnnie Cochran, the lead defense attorney, has been making his opening statement to the jury, interrupted a few times, which we'll talk about. The judge has just ordered a 10-minute recess, and Cynthia McFadden, our legal affairs correspondent, has slipped out of the courtroom to give us her impression. Cynthia.
Well, Peter, Johnnie Cochran, we now know why you wanted this to be on television, I think. He has a powerful presentation. It's powerful inside the courtroom. I bet it is outside as well. He's using written, typed, and highlighted notes at the podium. 3 of the jurors have been intermittently taking notes. As far as the family's reaction, I don't think you can see the family anymore. None of the Brown family has reacted at all, nor has the Goldman family to anything that he's been saying. They've been stoic. At one point, however, Mrs. Simpson, O.J. Simpson's mother, when he referred to his Mr. Simpson's generosity to his mother, she sat and affirmatively and very aggressively nodded her head. Tension in the courtroom is, I think tension may be the right word. There's this sort of, if yesterday everyone felt a little bit frozen in amber, today I think there's a tremendous sense of excitement. One of the jurors is actually leaning forward almost to the rail, the juror in the 3rd position, leaning forward, listening. They're really paying attention.
Now, there are a number of things that we've heard before, and there are a couple of things I think that have been introduced in a more formal way than we've heard before. Most notably, the 4 men who were seen, according to Mr. Cochran, in the neighborhood of Nicole Simpson's condominium at about the time she was murdered. We've heard rumors about this. We've never seen it so forthrightly put.
Yeah, I think that's certainly right, Peter. We've heard also just confirmation that Marcus Garvey apparently was indeed having an affair at some point with Nicole Brown Simpson. Marcus Garvey, the friend of Mr. Simpson, who was indeed married at Mr. Simpson's home. Mr. Cochran did not mention him by name. Mr. Garvey has continued, as I know, up till the present to deny that they had had a romance, but we also had confirmation of that. What we're seeing here is a sort of splatter defense, which we'd anticipated, throwing as much reasonable doubt up on the wall as possible and hoping that some of it will stick. Okay,
inadvertently, I think you mean to refer to Marcus Allen, not Marcus Garvey, but as the case... it would be understandable, as so many people who dedicated to the civil rights of mankind have been quoted today, that you quote Marcus Garvey, but it is Marcus Allen. There was also this reference made today to 2 people from Metzaluna walking in the neighborhood who are going to be introduced as evidence. Did we know anything about them in the past?
I've not heard about them. We had heard rumors that there were others on the street and that we would hear from others in the course of this trial who had been on that street that night. I had not heard about those 2. And you're right, Peter, we did hear at the beginning of Mr. Cochran's statement, Lincoln was quoted, Cicero was quoted, Martin Luther King Jr. was quoted, and it raised an objection by the state.
Now, Johnnie Cochran, this lead defense attorney, has had an enormous amount of publicity for being the absolute master at doing what he is doing. You're quite right, as you pointed out to us yesterday, different in the courtroom than it is on television. How does it look in the courtroom?
You know, one thing that surprised me, at several points, Mr. Cochran made wry remarks or things that would cause a smile. In fact, I mean, I could feel myself responding to what he was saying. As I looked at the jurors, at a couple of points, no smiles, no nods of heads. Of course, the jurors aren't supposed to be either agreeing or disagreeing. They're supposed to be listening, and they seem to be doing that. But there wasn't the kind of response back that I think lawyers sometimes hope for. I think that perhaps Leslie and Bob will have some insights into that. But he wasn't getting... if he was working the jury and hoping for some feedback from them, I didn't see him getting that.
Okay, Cynthia, thanks very much. I know you have to go back in the courtroom, so let us turn to at least 2 of our 3 legal analysts. Leslie Abramson has not joined us yet today, but Robert Philibosian is there. Mr. Philibosian, there's this remark from Mr. Cochran, they don't know this man, a reference to the characterizations made yesterday by the prosecution. Is this about what you'd expect?
Absolutely. Johnnie Cochran is letting the jury know that he knows O.J. Simpson, and he is doing what some well-known defense attorneys do, and that is trying to project his own image, which is a very favorable image, onto the defendant and cloak the defendant with his own image, almost saying to the jury, without saying so in so many words, this man is innocent. If he weren't innocent, I wouldn't be here defending him. And as Cynthia makes the point, the jurors did not respond to the somewhat wry remarks of Mr. Cochran. I don't think they're yet comfortable enough. They're still in a very formal situation, but Mr. Cochran wants to start making them feel comfortable. He will hope at some point during the course of this trial to actually get them to laugh at some of his wry remarks, because there's an old saying among prosecutors, a laughing jury is not a convicting jury. And so defense attorneys who are able to will try to get the jury to laugh.
Probably early days for that, I quite agree. We'll continue our analysis of this while we wait for Judge E to reconvene the court, but we'll take a brief break and come back in a minute.
ABC News coverage of the state versus O.J. Simpson will continue in a moment.
The O.J. Simpson trial is in recess briefly, and I want to go to our legal analyst, Peter Arnella, from the University of California in Los Angeles. Peter, I know the tendency now is to judge performance, but I want to stick for a second, if I may, with this introduction of the 4 men and the 2 walkers-by on South Bundy at about the time the murder apparently occurred, or at least occurred according to the prosecution. This is pretty new. Significance?
Well, it's significant if at trial itself there can be some credible evidence here about these 4 men, and the prosecution isn't able to explain who these 4 men are. We don't know, for instance, in terms of the time frame testimony as to whether these witnesses really are all that reliable in terms of the exact time frame in which they said they saw these people, and time frame is really of the essence here. So it really remains to be seen how significant this little wrinkle is in terms of the evidence. But
Mr. Cochran keeps arguing to the timeline, and in fact we had heard some rumors that they were going to come forward with the sort of the Colombian drug gang defense, didn't we?
Right, we did. I think, though, that most of his argument has been focusing, Peter, not on an alternative explanation for the killings, at least so far, but most of it is focused on responding to Christopher Darden. And I think that that was very likely, because the prosecution, by emphasizing domestic abuse and a history of control and domination, laid themselves open to exactly what's occurring today, which is a very different picture of this relationship and of Mr. Simpson. And with all of the evidence that Mr. Cochran will be presenting, the danger here is the jury will lose sight of all of the damning physical evidence linking Mr. Simpson to the crime. And if you notice, Johnnie Cochran has spent very little time so far talking about the physical evidence. He made a brief allusion to an expert who was going to testify about how PCR evidence can be easily contaminated, but he has spent almost all of his time on the picture of Mr. Simpson that was painted by Christopher Darden, and I think he's done an effective job.
On the other hand, he did say that he was going to speak this afternoon and maybe tomorrow as well, so I assume that you're quite correct. He hasn't mentioned up until now. Talk to me about Lenore Walker in terms of evidence. She is sometimes called, according to Mr. Cochran, the mother of the battered woman syndrome understanding. In California, you have experts on everything available to you. Can you tell us more about that?
Dr. Lenore Walker really was the creator of the battered women syndrome. It was a device to explain to juries why women who claimed that they were terribly abused didn't leave their abuser. It was used to defend women who killed their abusers, and it was done to bolster the credibility of these women when they took the stand and testified to terrible, prolonged abuse that they suffered before they killed their abuser. And the problem was that jurors, listening to this testimony without the help of experts, often had trouble believing the women on trial for murder. The jurors' reaction was, if that was me and I was being terribly abused, I would have left. And so Dr. Lenore Walker was instrumental in testifying to this battered women syndrome, the cycle of violence, and learned helplessness to explain why abused women would take this abuse and not leave.
Thank you, Peter. Going to go back into the courtroom now because, in fact, Judge Ida has come back into the court and we're about to reconvene.
Tape. It does not appear apparent to me, but I only took about 30 seconds to look at it. We'll look into it at noon, but I just thought I'd let you, don't go away.
Well, I guess I can put a cloth there for the security concerns, right?
No, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take hairspray so that it won't reflect, is what I'm going to do. But rather than have everybody move while I hairspray it, we'll... All right, Deputy Magnero, let's have the jurors, please. And Mr. Cochran, I'll allow you to, if you want to slop over a couple of minutes there, but close to
Exactly
12,
sure what they're discussing at the moment. There's a reference to hairspray being used as a dulling spray over something that may be causing a distracting reflection.
My guess is we're...
It may be that the jurors are being seen on the reflection of the bailiff's table. And we already know how careful the judge has been about this.
That's all right.
All right, here are the jurors.
So the jury's going to come back in again. And there you get as much, well, not as much about them altogether as we know, but there you get a representation of them in terms of who they are. The number of men, the number of women, the number of blacks, whites, 2 Latinos, 1 man who is both Caucasian and Native American. We know a little bit more about them in terms of their jobs, and as the trial ensues, we'll perhaps get to that. They are, as you know, sequestered. The judge has enabled them, granted them
We've been rejoined by
visits with their families. They are going to be able to watch the Super Bowl. And you've heard from Cynthia McFadden so far how they have reacted.
All right, Mr. Cochran.
Spellbound by Mr. Darden and very engaged by Mr. Cochran so far.
Certainly.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I wanted to try to pick up where we left off. To conclude those remarks about this friend, I think that speaks volumes about Mr. Simpson, his stability, his relationship with his ex-wife. I think the evidence will also show that in about May of 1992, Miss Nicole Brown Simpson came over to the Rockingham house and said she'd found a boyfriend, somebody different than Keith, where the incident was April of 1992, and asked Mr. Simpson for some advice. He, of course, knew at that point that it was over and he was back with Paula and went on with his life, as I said, until such time as in 1993. She decided she wanted to get back together at that point. Now, to clear up, I want to always keep the faith with you about being as accurate as I can. The 2 incidents that they talked about. On the one incident involving the man Joe Stellini, that was at Mezzaluna. The other incident was a restaurant called Tryst. In both incidents, there was no problem, no fight. In fact, in the Tryst incident, I believe it was, at the Mezzaluna incident, Mr. Simpson went home with his wife that night. So that there was not any incident where they were stalking or fighting, anything like that. There was no obsessive behavior. I hope that you put those in some kind of perspective. Mr. Darden talked in his opening statement about a 1985 incident in which some damage was done to a vehicle. And as I understand it, the testimony will be that was not any incident in 1985 because Miss Nicole Brown Simpson was pregnant, had a C-section later in that year, and they didn't have any situation like that. They did have some discussion, apparently, maybe in 86 or in 84. There was some damage done to her car, and she was not in that car. She was not struck on that occasion. So I think you'll find an incident of not great consequence. And Mr. Darden talked about the 19 93 911 tape that you've heard so much about. And I think even he conceded yesterday that in that situation, although you could hear Mr. Simpson's voice, he was angry, Mr. Simpson never laid a hand on his wife, never called her a name. And I think the important thing about a trial is that finally you're going to get to hear all of this tape. And what you're going to hear, Mr. Darden didn't tell you this yesterday, is that there was a discussion on this 911 tape. And he alluded to the fact that Mr. Simpson couldn't get out of his mind what he'd seen back on April 1992. Well, now, first of all, most of us might have a problem getting that picture out of our mind of seeing your wife making love to someone else. But at any rate, this wasn't the reason for the argument. What had happened was, and the facts will be, that when they started trying to get back together again in 93, they had an agreement that they would take the pictures of their boyfriends and girlfriends out of the, you put them away, basically, which seemed to be a reasonable request. And there was a dispute because when Miss Brown Simpson would ever see Paula Barberi's picture, she was very upset about that. And Mr. Simpson, on this date, I believe, saw a picture of somebody that she had dated during the time they'd been separated. And he said, gee, what's fair for me will be fair for you. And they got into this conversation that went over a period of time. At some point, it was just a verbal conversation. It escalated, and tempers flared. It sometimes happens with married couples. Doesn't make it right, but sometimes it happens. He came over to her house, and he did, in fact, kick a French door. The evidence will be the door was already broken. He fixed it, but he never at any time struck his wife during this period of time. And what he was saying, at some point, she says, OJ, be quiet. What about the kids? And he says, essentially, you weren't thinking about the kids and being quiet when you were on the couch with Keith. And I think you'll hear that on the tape. So you put it in perspective, and the important point to make is that nobody was ever injured during this period of time. In fact, there is a tape recording and a transcript from some police officers who came out and talked with these parties. And in that tape, you'll get a chance to hear what Miss Brown Simpson thought about that incident. And they also talked to OJ, who waited there for him. He agreed to fix that door. And they went on with their lives. They went on and continued during that period of time to get along. This was the time they were back together. You should note that Mr. Simpson, because of how he's conducted his life and the things he's done in his life, has been able to amass some assets. Not bad for a young man, a spindly-legged youth from San Francisco, who suffered with rickets, who had trouble walking, was cared for by his mother, who grew up to become the greatest running back in the history of the National Football League. And so, because of that and his commercial endorsements and things, he's able to have several homes. He has a home in New York. And the evidence will be that in August of each year, because of his commitments with NBC, he would go and live in New York. And so he wouldn't try to control Miss Nicole Brown Simpson. I mean, she would do what she wanted to while he was here. Even during 93, he was living in New York from like August to like January, maybe after the Super Bowl or whatever, till August to January. He'd be back there at his New York house. He also had a house in Laguna Beach in Orange County. And one thing I forgot to tell you about the circle of benevolence. He assisted his wife in buying a condo in Laguna for herself, separate from his house. So when she was at Rockingham, she had 2 condos in her own name. One in Laguna, one in San Francisco, she's getting money from, and living at Rockingham. They didn't tell you about that. He also had bought some property in Cabo San Lucas where he planned to build. All of the things that he was doing was about the family, about keeping the family together, about doing things with in-laws and with friends and with the children. So I think you'll hear evidence about the fact that he was away at great periods of time. And while I'm about that, let me tell you about the kind of schedule this man had. You won't be able to see his calendar yet, but at some point, hopefully, we will. If you went back and looked at Mr. O.J. Simpson's daily calendar from January to June of 1994, you'd find a man that in January was out of town and probably still living in New York almost every day. But he was out of New York because he was traveling. Some of you who know this is Super Bowl week, you can imagine that he was in Atlanta that week, because that's what the Super Bowl was last year, that the evidence will be that this was a time that he and his wife were trying to make it, that he took some family members, the Browns from Germany, to the Super Bowl in Atlanta, paid for all of them, got them 50-yard seats, took them to all the big parties that are going on this week. He was again out of town during almost all of that particular month. If you looked at his calendar and you're able to be testimony that in February, he spent a lot of time in Cabo San Lucas. He was in Nashville, in St. Louis, in Miami. In Miami again, involved in charitable work. A few days where you find he was even here in Los Angeles. If you looked at March, you'd find that he was in New York. He was doing Bryant Gumbel's charitable golf tournament in Orlando, Florida. Back in New York again. He was all over the country doing various and sundry things. You got to the month of April, he was back in Cabo. From there he came back to Los Angeles. Then he went to Puerto Rico. Evidence will be that some of you know he's an actor, a would-be actor, and that he made this movie Frogman during that period of time in Puerto Rico. Again, very much out of California. And in May, with the exception of some things that he came to do for his children, and by the way, again, talking about the kind of things that he would do at Rockingham. And you'll see this place at Rockingham. On May 22nd, he had a school picnic at Rockingham. Got a number of kids, and I think that's for the Sunshine Preschool. That is where his son Justin went. It was a fundraiser for this school. They have all these kids, and all the people would come to his house at Rockingham to raise money for the school. On May 22nd, he did that. And Nicole Brown Simpson was there. And even though they had agreed in May, earlier that month in May, and he was now back with Paula, when Nicole Brown Simpson got sick the week of May 15th, 1994, she had pneumonia. O.J. Simpson was the one who took her soup, who tried to nurse her back, to get her back on her feet, even though they agreed they weren't going to be together anymore. You heard testimony with regard to that. And he continued, of course, being in and out of town. In June of 1994, he'd had and had taken his two children, Sydney and Justin. And let me say something at this point. Mr. Simpson has two other children that he's equally proud of. The minors cannot be here, obviously, for obvious reasons. But he has two other children that he's equally proud of, and they're here in court today. And there's Arnell Simpson over there and Jason Simpson, sitting between his two sisters, Carmelita Duro and Miss Shirley Baker, and the balance of the family. And you've met Miss Eunice Simpson already. So he, on May 5th, attended a pediatric AIDS affair. Again, his interest in children and AIDS and charitable work, along with Paula. And he took the two younger children. It was a real fine day. And that was on that Sunday. On that Tuesday, he left to go to Washington, D.C. again. He left town. He had to work. On Wednesday, he was working for Hertz in Washington, D.C. On Thursday, he's in Connecticut, working again at one of his board meetings. He's on these various boards, some charitable, some profitable, hopefully. He was in Connecticut. On Friday, Thursday night, he was in New York with his friend Bender. And he'd work, and he'd try to play golf during these periods of time. You recall I mentioned that Mr. Bender suggested, you're going to be in Chicago on Tuesday or Monday night. Stay over. He came home for the recital. And when you see his calendar, you'll see it's planned all the way out, far beyond June, of course, of 1994. But it gives you a sense of this man, this man's life, what he'd been able to do with his life and with himself. I point out these things to you because I think as you look at all of the incidents that Mr. Darden talked about, it puts them into perspective. This is not a case about domestic abuse. It's a murder case. It's a murder case about who did these horrible crimes. That's going to be your decision. Not to think that O.J. Simpson is a bad guy or a good guy, for that matter, but to get a picture of him. I think that you'll agree with me that after you hear the facts, you'll have a clearer picture. Now, about the we talked about the 1993 incident, I think we did. And I think those are the main incidents that Mr. Darden talked about. One thing I wanted to point out to you is that there will be, I believe, testimony that as these parties got a divorce, as so often happens, Miss Nicole Brown Simpson had her deposition taken. And she made a statement in that deposition with regard to whether or not he'd ever physically struck her after the '89 incident. And it'll be interesting to hear what that is. That this Mark Furman becomes even more relevant in this case as we go along and discuss it, because he was the officer who had supposedly responded, he says, in '85. There's evidence that the incident involving the bat and the Mercedes was not in '85 because she was pregnant. But he writes a report 4 years later, in '89, saying he had an indelible impression of Mr. O.J. Simpson and coming to that location. An indelible impression. So we'll have to pursue what that means in this report that he wrote about that incident some 4 years later and whether or not it was accurate. It was not done contemporaneously with the incident. Mr. Darden also said to us that this was not a tabloid prosecution. Well, that's interesting, isn't it? He used those words, didn't he? He said, first of all, this wasn't character assassination, which we now know it was. And he says it's not a tabloid prosecution. Well, I think the evidence will be that after this book that you've heard about from his so-called friend Faye Resnick came out, it's when the people started getting all these witnesses who wanted to come forward, talk about these incidents. So whether or not it's a tabloid prosecution is not for me to say. It's going to be for you to say. Let me say this about Faye Resnick.
Counsel?
I'm
sorry to interrupt.
Okay. Go ahead,
Your Honor, once again, my objection has been previously noted.
I caution you, Mr. Cochran, about what you're just about to launch into, because that person's not on the witness list. And when you say, let me tell you about somebody, I'm concerned.
Right. You're right. And there's a possibility that...
All right, well, I think we should hear these objections at the sidebar.
Okay.
However,
I tell you, let's do it without the recording. I think we can resolve it. Right?
Please.
I'd like to have the recorder first.
No.
Another objection there from Bill Hodgman. The early take on these objections was, they were all overruled by Judge Ito early on, was that he'd given the prosecution some considerable latitude yesterday, and so he was going to give Mr. Cochran some considerable latitude today. But as Robert Philibosian, the former district attorney for Los Angeles County, I hope will tell us, been walking pretty close to the line there, Mr. Philibosian, right, in terms of whether or not he was arguing or simply setting out the guidelines of where the defense was going to go?
Peter, Johnnie Cochran walked over the line on a number of occasions and did engage in argument, but of course the prosecution did the same thing. And as I said yesterday, I thought that the prosecution was not being interrupted by Mr. Cochran because he hoped that if they interrupted him when he did the same thing, he would turn to the judge and say, look, Judge, I didn't interrupt them, don't let them interrupt me. But I think he's gone too far now in mentioning witnesses who will not even be called because they're not on the witness list. And he almost got in trouble again because he started to say something in open court about the fact that they may call that witness. If that witness not on the witness list, then he's going to be in deep trouble. So he wanted to go to the bench without the reporter. The prosecution wisely said, no, we want the reporter there. In a case like this, I wouldn't do anything without having the reporter there with me at the judge's bench.
It is certainly true that there are numerous opportunities for us to learn something about the court system here. You passed a note a short while ago, which I'm fascinated with. You said that if the defense admits into evidence all these charity functions to which Mr. Cochran is referring on O.J. Simpson's calendar, that actually speaks to the character issue and lets the prosecution deal with the character issue. Can you explain that a bit further?
Well, that's right. The prosecution cannot put the defendant's character into issue themselves. But if the defense puts the defendant's character into issue, and this is what is, it's a legitimate factor in defending a case, and that would be essentially telling the jury a man of this good character wouldn't commit a horrible crime like this. But if the defense does that, then the prosecution is entitled to rebut that with evidence of bad character, and they can bring in all kinds of incidents involving Mr. Simpson that would tend to show his bad character and detract from his good character.
And in a phrase, do you think that the calendar as presented might be useful in that regard?
Thank you.
No, unless they push the point that these were charity events and he was a charitable contributor.
I talked briefly about
back to Johnnie Cochran.
witness Faye Resnick. And you may or may not hear from her. She's on our witness list. There's a possibility. We may call her for a number of reasons because...
Object, Your Honor. There's only a possibility. Counsel,
overruled. The reason why I think the evidence will show and will be relevant to you is that on or about June 3rd of 1994, Faye Resnick, who had had a long-time relationship with a Dr. Christian Reichardt, whom we will definitely be calling, they'd been living together for a long time. And because of her drug usage, because of the fact she was freebasing cocaine, he put her out literally. They broke up. She was one of these parties who they ran in this circle out there in Brentwood. And when she was put out on June 3rd, which I think was a Friday, she then moved over and lived with Nicole Brown Simpson because they were friends. They would go out at night. These were all friends. The evidence will be these ladies would go out 2, 3, 4 nights a week and stay out till 5 o'clock in the morning. Nobody was controlling these women. There's a group of them, and you'll hear about it. They go out dancing. They do whatever they would do. And we know Faye Resnick was using drugs in this period of time. It got so bad, the evidence will be that on June 8th, 1994, they had what we call an intervention. That Nicole and Kristen Reichardt and her former husband, Paul Resnick, all got together to try and convince her that she had to go into a drug treatment facility called Exodus. And on the 8th of June...
Excuse me, counsel. I'm sorry once again. Your Honor, you had asked us or given us leave to address these issues.
Overruled. Please be seated.
In noon hour.
Please be seated.
Very well.
Thank you.
Goes into a drug treatment facility on June 8th, and she remains there, and she's there on June 12th. And I think you hear from the evidence that she is one of the people who calls Miss Nicole Brown Simpson on the night of June 12th, perhaps after 9 o'clock, that particular night, from this drug treatment facility. We'll be talking about that and her role in this whole drama. To conclude, then, what I've tried to do in this opening statement is to lay out for you the fact that in almost everything you hear in this case, there are two sides. That as jurors, I'm sure you're not going to rush to judgment. But this should not be a case about character assassination, and I hope you will keep an open mind until you hear all of the evidence as it relates to who Mr. Simpson is. Now, shifting our attention now to the discussion, the very able discussion of Miss Marcia Clark yesterday. It seemed to me, as you summarized what she had to say to you, that her argument broke down, or, well, it was argument at the end, but her opening statement broke down into a discussion of timeline and so-called evidence trails. Let me, first of all, talk to you about the concept of the timeline. We've talked a little bit about that. And let me tell you what she didn't tell you about. And some of this we'll cover, so I won't be redundant. But there are witnesses like the lady who lived next door to Mr. Simpson. There's a Mr. Tom Lang that she knows about and didn't tell you about, who on this particular night, June 12th, 1994, was walking his dog on a street called Dorothy Street, right down the way from Mr. Cole Brown Simpson's condo at 875. That from his vantage point, just a short distance on the corner, he looked up and he saw a lady that he believes was Miss Nicole Brown Simpson, either embracing someone at a vehicle at the curb And behind Miss Simpson, he saw a man that he described as a Hispanic or Caucasian standing with his hands clenched, standing there looking as though he was angry. And he didn't know why this man was looking like this. And this is about 10 o'clock on June 12th. Whether he was angry because Mr. Langwood didn't know whether he was angry because his dog was loose or what. But again, this is what I expect his testimony to be. This is at 10 o'clock. And he sees a lady that he believes is Nicole Brown Simpson at that point. I talked to you briefly before about Ellen Aronson and Dan Mandel, who she didn't talk to, but she's talked to them, but she didn't talk about them yesterday, as they walk past this place, right at about 10:25 or thereabouts. And there's another witness, whose name is Robert Heidstra. Robert Heidstra is in an alley one street over. But when you go out there, you'll be able to see how well you can hear late at night, especially on a Sunday night at this location. Mr. Heidstra, according to his statements, is walking in this alley. And now it's about 10:35 or 10:40. As he walks parallel to where the Bundy residence is, will be then looking west, he hears the sound of like arguing, and he hears someone or a voice say, "Hey, hey, hey," and he hears the sound of a fence closing, and he continues on walking his dog. Now this is at 10:40 or thereabouts, and you know then at 10:45, Marianne Gertjes sees these four men running from 875 down toward her direction, and she believes they're coming after her at that point. In her statement to you yesterday, Ms. Clark talked to you a lot about Alan Park, and I read you some of his transcripts, some of his testimony that you didn't hear about. And I think there'll be considerably more with regard to Mr. Park and to Mr. Cato Kalin. An interesting man, and I think that it'll be interesting when you hear from Mr. Cato Kalin about Mr. Simpson and how he appeared that night. Just before we wrap up for lunch, I think the evidence will show you that in order to believe that O.J. Simpson committed these horrible murders, you'd have to believe that he came back from back east where he'd been working to come to his daughter's recital, attended that recital. You see his picture there. He was home getting ready for a trip to Chicago that had been long pre-planned, that he was hungry. The evidence will be that he didn't have any dollar bills or $20 bills, that he asked to borrow some money from Cato Kalin. Cato Kalin gave him this money, went and had a Big Mac. You have to believe that he was planning to kill his wife either before he got this Big Mac or then went and got the Big Mac. That Cato Kalin will describe. He was dressed in some kind of a sweat clothes and some tennis shoes. If you follow the people's case, you'd have to believe that he then came home and said, "Gee, I think what I'll do is I'll go over and kill my wife now, and I think I'll take these tennis shoes off and put on some dress shoes, some hard-soled shoes, and change clothes," knowing he's going to be leaving shortly to go to the airport. And then you'd have to believe that, to believe their theory. And then to make their theory work, they spend all this time talking about the plaintive wail of a dog, because they've got to make this as early as possible at 10:15. We know that that's not correct, based upon the facts that you've heard. And to conclude, isn't it interesting that in all of the discussion yesterday by these two very excellent lawyers, they never once mentioned their coroner, Dr. Golden. He's another mysterious mystery witness they don't want to talk about. And when we come back this afternoon, let's talk about why the prosecution doesn't want you to know about Dr. Golden. Let's talk about when Ms. Clark says, well, you can't really fix the time of death here with any precision. We will have testimony from one of the leading pathologist in the United States, Michael Batten, who's also worked for the LA County District Attorney's Office, who's written a book about the John Belushi death. He was able to pinpoint the time of death to within 1 hour. And yet in this case, because the coroner was not called for 10 hours after these bodies were found, or 8 hours, and they got out there about 10 hours, violating the state law, we are precluded from pinpointing this. And they have to tell you that it's about a dog's wail when a man's life is at stake. We'll pick up after lunch, Your Honor.
Thank you, Mr. Cochran. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we will stand in recess for the jury until 1:30. Let me speak to counsel after the jury has departed. All right, let's clear the courtroom, please.
It is only noon on the West Coast, in the Western time zone, and they are going to now recess for an hour and a half for the luncheon break, with Mr. Cochran concluding there, making mention for about the third or fourth time now, the wail of a dog, which Ms. Clark used yesterday to pinpoint the time of death, and picking on it 3 times as being a sort of indefensible point on which to stand. Bring back our legal analysts, Robert Philibosian and Peter Arnella. Peter Arnella, impressions of the morning session.
Well, I think Johnnie Cochran has done a superb job pointing out to this jury the weaknesses in the prosecution's case. And at a rhetorical level, I think he's been quite good in the way he has framed those weaknesses. But it's still interesting to note how little at this juncture he has dealt with the actual physical evidence itself. And I think you're right to point out, as you did before, Peter, that he's bound to comment on it. But I doubt he's going to spend as much time on that physical evidence as he is on the weaknesses of the prosecution's case. And this is quite typical in a case like this where you're arguing reasonable doubt. You want to point out as many holes as you can in the prosecution's case in the hope that cumulatively the jury will lose trust in the prosecution and perhaps be diverted from what might be very reliable physical evidence of guilt.
When you say that he's pointing out weaknesses in the prosecution's case, you're presupposing here that he's right in all the cases he's making mention of.
Well, there's no dispute, and we'll hear this afternoon, that the coroner's office botched this investigation. That was very well established during the preliminary hearing. There'll be some considerable testimony about this at the trial, and after the lunch break, I'm sure Johnnie Cochran will be coming back to this. In fact, state laws were violated in how the coroner's investigation was conducted. So he's on very strong ground there. And I think he's also on very strong rhetorical ground when he points out that in some sense the prosecution is fixing the time of death at 10:15 simply by a dog wailing, and he has all of these witnesses to suggest that at least right now, before we see them, that the death must have occurred several minutes later at 10:30, 10:35, 10:40.
In the next several months, we're going to have a really vicious battle, I suspect, between expert witnesses. Am I right?
Absolutely. And in fact, one of the key witnesses for the defense, Dr. Lenora Walker, herself, I think, will prove to be very vulnerable to cross-examination by the prosecution because she has been rather inconsistent in some of her published writings. So you are going to see a battle of the experts. The question is, will the battle of experts on DNA and the battle of experts on domestic abuse cancel each other out, create such confusion in the jury's mind that the jurors say, well, I can't find guilt beyond a reasonable doubt based on this type of a battle. The reality is there's very powerful physical evidence in this case, and the key here is whether the defense can distract the jury from all of the physical evidence to focus on the battle of the experts and generate confusion.
You pointed out one rather nice, neat piece of courtroom technique about how Bill Hodgman is always the one to get up and object to the judge about testimony. Tell us why.
Well, I don't think it's an